Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, and a special welcome to our friends in Chile joining today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stuart Beck. I am President and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. I spent 32 years as a diplomat in the Canadian Foreign Service, retiring as Canada's High Commissioner to India in 2014. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you today to this panel discussion on CPTPP and economic opportunities in Southeast Asia, ASEAN as an economic region, presented with our partners at the Chile Pacific Foundation. With global politics being what they are now, there is more than ever a need for middle powers to diversify their economic and political interests. For Canada, which is highly dependent on the United States and China economically, we need to look to Asia and ASEAN in particular to diversify our markets and interests. Chile is facing similar challenges, and it only makes sense that our two organizations partner on a topic we are exploring together. As part of Canada's reflection on its colonial past, we always start our virtual and in-person sessions with a land acknowledgement. This is particularly relevant this week with the horrific revelation of mass graves of children attending a residential school in British Columbia. Residential schools for our First Nations communities is a relic of our colonial and settler past. So, I know many of you are joining us from across the world, from multiple time zones in Canada, Chile, and across the Asia Pacific region. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the places Canadians call home are the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. APF Canada is headquartered, and I myself am speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We are grateful to Canada's Indigenous peoples for their stewardship of the land on which we live, work, and play. We at APF Canada are collectively committed to the process of reconciliation. It's hard to believe it's been over a year since the beginning of the pandemic and the massive disruption it has caused across the globe. As challenging as the shift to this new virtual normal has been, it has facilitated closer collaboration between our organization like ours. The Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and the Chile Pacific Foundation signed an MOU back in 2019, recognizing at that time the potential for mutual collaboration. We are both the ABAC secretariats for our home economies, Pacific nations that literally face the immense and diverse economic opportunities in Asia, and we share a common commitment to promoting dialogue and understanding around free trade architecture, including the topic for today's discussion, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trade Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. In partnership with our friends at Chile Pacific Foundation, we have gathered an impressive group of experts today to think through the emerging trends and opportunities in Southeast Asia, one of the most dynamic regions in Asia. As co-signatories to the CPTPP, we hope today's discussion will provide insightful commentary on the growth of ASEAN and the challenges and opportunities it presents our respective economies. Before I turn over the floor to Dr. Klaus Schmidt-Hebel from the Chile Pacific Foundation to say a few words, let me go over a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is currently being recorded and will be available on our website shortly after. We encourage your questions and comments. Please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to submit your question. If we don't have a chance to answer your question live, please feel free to reach out to us offline. And for technical support, please reach out to Mandy at events@asiapacific.ca. Now let me introduce Dr. Klaus Schmidt-Hebel to make a few remarks on behalf of our partners at the Chile Pacific Foundation. Dr. Schmidt-Hebel is a member of the Chile Pacific Foundation's Board of Directors and an international consultant, advisor, and public speaker. He held the position of Chief Economist of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development and Director of the OECD Economics Department in Paris in 2008-2009. He was Chief of Economic Research at the Central Bank of Chile during the previous 12 years. Before that, he was Principal Economist in the Research Department of the World Bank in Washington. He has been Chairman of Chile's Advisory Fiscal Council, Chairman of the Financial Advisory Board of Chile's Sovereign Wealth Funds, General Director of Grupo de Publica Chile, President of the Chilean Economic Association, and President of the Monetary Club. He was elected 2008 Economist of the Year by his peers in Chile. Dr. Schmidt-Hebel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beck. Let me start again. I think now I've turned on the video and the voice. It is an enormous pleasure for me to participate in this outstanding panel discussion about CPTPP and economic opportunities in Southeast Asia, with a focus on ASEAN as an economic region. And certainly I am very happy that the partnership between the Asian Pacific Foundation of Canada and the Chile Pacific Foundation, of which I am a board member, is starting extremely well with this seminar. I'm also looking forward to the next two seminars which we are doing jointly. As a board member of the Chile Pacific Foundation, I strongly support activities such as this one, which link the efforts of Canada and Chile in working together to shed light on the strategic importance and economic potential of the ASEAN region for Chile, for Canada, and for the Americas as a whole. I'm very proud of the work carried out by the Chile Pacific Foundation to bring Chile and the Asia Pacific, also the Indo-Pacific region, closer to each other. By taking part of a growing international network of world-class partners, of which the Asian Pacific Foundation of Canada is an outstanding member, our foundation is working on and promoting a forward-looking agenda to deepen Chile's commitment and strategic projection to the Pacific region in many dimensions, including trade, investment, and also political cooperation to handle many of the most pressing issues of our time. The Asia-Pacific and the Pacific region brings for us great opportunities to fuel much needed growth in our economies, most notably during the economic recovery phase of this terrible world pandemic. In this context, our growing partnership with the ASEAN region is a key component of our strategic integration to the Pacific Basin. It is reflected both in bilateral and multilateral economic integration agreements with ASEAN members and through our membership of CPTPP. Let me end finally with two remarks about Chile's commitment to CPTPP, which I think will be interesting to note for our Canadian friends. First, in reviewing the economic literature about the economic benefits for all 11 members of CPTPP, we have a figure which estimates that the long-term GDP level of all 11 members will, on average, be raised by 0.8%. 0.8 seems like a small number. It's a huge number. If every country gains 1% of its long-term GDP level, that's billions of dollars for all the citizens of the 11 members of CPTPP. In the case of Chile, the average gain is smaller. Why? Because we are an already very open economy. Specifically, we are more open than the average CPTPP member. And therefore, our increase in long-term GDP level is by quote unquote only 0.3%. Now, 0.3% still is a big number for Chile. It's something like 600 million or 700 million US dollars per year as simply a result of increased trade, increased investment, and other mechanisms of transmission by which we reap those benefits. Second, I would also like to mention a fact which is probably of interest to our Canadian friends, and which is the fact that there is an influential minority in Chile that is blocking parliamentary ratification of Chile's CPTPP 11 membership. It is basically an ideological opposition by a minority, but as I said before, which is very influential, that exposes fake news and lies about the effect of CPTPP for Chile. And therefore we have a big agenda, which we push together between many important members of Congress, plus the government, plus this foundation, in trying to convince Congress that the economic, social, and also political benefits of a closer partnership through CPTPP with the Asia Pacific region and also with Canada and some other Latin American country members would be of enormous net benefit to Chile. Finally, let me end by wishing us all a very successful seminar and a fruitful discussion of the issues covered by our outstanding speakers. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And I empathize with your challenges in getting these important issues through. As you know, we had some hiccups ourselves in the early process of CPTPP, and we managed to work through that. And I think everybody in Canada understands the importance of agreements like these for a small economy, well, small country in terms of population, big country in terms of size, but we are a trading nation, and having these access to these instruments are so important for our success in our future. And one person on our panel today, a former board director at the foundation, Jean Charest, will, I'm sure, speak eloquently to that. And you know, when you think about Canada and Chile, there's so much that we have in common that hopefully we can learn from each other as we approach the Asia Pacific region, Indo-Pacific, as it's becoming, as we're calling it now. This, I think, is really an important reason for our partnership and for being able to work together on a series like we're doing. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeff Reeves, Vice President of Research and Strategy at APF Canada, who will be the moderator of today's discussion. So Jeff, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. Good morning, evening, and afternoon to all our participants and observers. My name is Jeff Reeves, and I am the Vice President for Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. I can't tell you how pleased I am today to be moderating the events together with the Chile Pacific Foundation. It has been nearly 2 years since our institution signed a memorandum of understanding and agreement to work more closely together, and this is a wonderful first effort to operationalize that agreement. Now, from a Canadian perspective, I can also say with all sincerity that I agree with both of the opening remarks, that it's an important opportunity as well to highlight opportunities within the Canada-Chile relations, particularly as I believe there are so many potential areas where our two states can work together, not just within Asia, but with bilateral relations and bilateral ties focused on the Americas and the Pacific region. I hope today's event and those following it in the coming weeks and months will be the first of many. But onto the topic at hand, which undoubtedly needs more time for discussion, but which we'll nevertheless try to tackle in a way today that does it some justice. Now, we're lucky to that end to have a wonderful panel of speakers that we do today, each of who will approach Southeast Asia's political economy and issues including the CPTPP from a different perspective, and who together will provide us a comprehensive starting point for more informed discussion going forward. To start, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Jayant Menon from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies at the Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. Dr. Menon will start our discussion today by commenting on Southeast Asia's regional economic architecture, providing us all with a valuable perspective from the Asian region. Following Dr. Menon, we have Dr. Grace Jaramillo from the School of Public Policy at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Jaramillo will build on Dr. Menon's comments to provide us with a Pacific viewpoint of Southeast Asia, with particular focus on Chile's role in the region and opportunities for greater economic integration and cooperation. And we'll round out our panel today with Mr. Jean Charest, Honorary Chair at the Canada-ASEAN Business Council and partner at McCarthy Tetrault. Mr. Charest will provide us with his thoughts on Canada's opportunities for engagement in Southeast Asia and with ASEAN, with a particular focus on economic diversification and the perspective on Canada's other economic relations within Asia and beyond the region. Now, following the panelists' remarks, I'll open the floor to questions and answers. As noted earlier, you can type your questions into the Zoom question function, and we'll do our best to consolidate questions to make sure we can cover as much ground as possible. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Menon to kick off our discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. I hope you can all see and hear me well. As Jeff mentioned, I've been asked to provide the perspective from the ASEAN region. I'm here in Singapore, and I'm a Malaysian by birth. So let me spend the next 7 minutes or so talking about the important things as far as trade and trade agreements are concerned, the important things for the ASEAN countries as I see them. The two most important agreements for ASEAN, apart from their own, which is the ASEAN Economic Community, which they hope to realize by 2025, the two most important other agreements are the CPTPP, of course, but also RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that was just signed at the end of last year, creating the world's largest FTA, in fact, the largest FTA in history. So I'll talk about both of these two agreements in the next few minutes, but I also want to mention at the outset that all members of ASEAN are also members of the WTO. And so that's an important factor. They are all active members, interested in the multilateral process. And many of them are also, in fact, most of them are also members of APEC. Right. And they've all been pursuing bilateral agreements quite aggressively, some of them deeper than others. Singapore in particular has been pursuing a lot of quite modern, deep agreements. The agreement on digital trade is one I'm sure they're all familiar with, since Chile is a member and Canada might also be part of it. So the bilateral agreements are also very much a feature of the landscape of the ASEAN region. But let me talk about the two big agreements, starting with the CPTPP, and of course, reminding us that it was signed in March of 2018 in Santiago, of course, and entered into force quite soon after, by the end of 2018. When we had 6 countries ratify it. Of course, Chile hasn't ratified it yet, and neither has Malaysia and a couple of others. But RCEP, on the other hand, was more recently signed at the end of last year, and actually came at a time when we were still struggling with the pandemic, of course. So it sent a very important signal that in the most difficult of times, a group of, an all-Asian affair, a group of countries in this region could come together and conclude the world's biggest FTA. Of course, the RCEP and CPTPP are very different agreements. They're less different now because the TPP became the CPTPP. So with that transition, which involved 22 provisions of the original TPP being either suspended or revised, we have a much more diluted agreement, and I think a much better agreement. I wasn't a fan of the original TPP, with especially its intellectual property provisions and biologics and so on, which I think was very unfair to developing countries. But I think the CPTPP is a much more friendly agreement to a broader constituency. So it's a lot less dissimilar, but still the differences with RCEP are quite stark. The CPTPP is obviously much more ambitious. It deals with more WTO plus issues. I mentioned the digital trade issue already. That's a critical element. RCEP deals with more traditional market access issues and is more regional, unlike the CPTPP, which is spread quite disparately around the world, especially now that we hear that the UK might join. But RCEP is also designed to consolidate the supply chains in this region. The approach that RCEP has taken is to basically leave no stone unturned. It has 20 chapters, which covers a very wide range of issues, but the depth is left to the countries to then negotiate as they move forward in implementing the agreement. So we still don't know, but it's unlikely to be as deep as the CPTPP, but it's open. It really will depend on how member countries use it to pursue national reforms. And the jury is still out in that regard. But I think for ASEAN, the most important thing when it comes to both these agreements is that they remain open and outward looking. ASEAN is a small region caught in the middle of giants on both sides, and importantly, very engaged with the global economy. They cannot sustain themselves by looking inward. They have to keep the doors open. ASEAN has done that with its own agreements, and both RCEP and CPTPP will be of greatest value to them, and in fact to the world, if they remain open to new members and outward looking, in the sense that accords are multilateralized. So this is particularly important now that we are still recovering from a rules-based trading system that's been in chaos, especially during the Trump administration, where the WTO was significantly weakened. And in fact, its dispute settlement mechanism was in paralysis after the Trump administration did not reappoint judges to the appellate body, leaving it without a quorum. We hope that the new US administration will have a different position, and the new DG will take this forward in a positive way. So let me try and wrap up now by making one more point, and that is I've already talked about how RCEP and CPTPP will be critical to this region if it remains open and outward looking. But the other factor that's particularly important to ASEAN is early resolution of the US-China trade war. This is a very important issue for ASEAN. They're caught in the middle. They don't want to take sides. China is very important to all these countries because of the supply chain and because of trade and investment, but so is the US. And the US is more important to some than others for non-economic and geostrategic reasons. So they don't want to have to pick sides, and they haven't. But the sooner we resolve this trade war, the better it will be for this region and indeed the world as a whole. If we can find a way in which we can bring these two warring partners together, either through a CPTPP, RCEP union, or an expansion, or an altogether new agreement like the APEX FTAP, Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific, I think then the interests of ASEAN, as well as the world, would be best served. We don't know, there's no easy way of moving forward on this. but it's important that we try and resolve the trade war, and as much as possible, if these agreements can play a role in moving us in that direction, I think ASEAN especially, but the world as a whole, will be made much better off. So I think, I'm sorry I've taken a bit more time than I planned, but with that, let me stop there, Jeff, and turn it back to you. I look forward to the questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Menon. What an excellent overview of the regional trade and economic architecture with that focus on ASEAN. Dr. Jaramillo, I wonder if you could pick up from there and describe a little bit the view from Chile and perhaps from with respect to the Pacific Alliance, or whatever other points you'd like to expand on.
For sure. I want to first thank the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and Fundación Chilena del Pacífico for inviting me to this forum. And I will complement Dr. Menon's comprehensive explanation of ASEAN architecture with a brief overview of what is going on the east side of the Pacific. This is the Western Hemisphere. I think the Western Hemisphere has been abundant in early projects of regionalism, focused mainly in the past in import substitution industrialization. However, in the 1990s, it brought the most radical liberalization efforts in the region. NAFTA, for example, was the first trade agreement signed in the world under the premise of lowering all trade barriers and to create a free market area by 1994. So the domino effect soon became pervasive in the region. Chile followed immediately and became the most daring negotiator of FTAs in the world, besides the United States. Now, with the exception of Ecuador, all Latin American countries with shores to the Pacific have signed FTAs with the US, with the European Union, and the European Free Trade Area at the very least. 3 of them have also signed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, better known in Canada as the CPTPP, Mexico, Chile, and Peru. Having said that, I have 3 points to make about the Latin America side of the Pacific Rim when it comes to trade and integration into the Asia-Pacific area. First, by far the most daring and organized attempts to engage with the Asia-Pacific region comes from Chile. Chile has been at the vanguard of this effort from the early 90s, as I said, and by now it has mastered the art of playing against all odds when it comes to trade liberalization, even being the first country in Latin America to negotiate an FTA with China, and one of the founding members of what will become the Trans-Pacific Partnership, along with Brunei, New Zealand, and Singapore. However, only Mexico had ratified the treaty so far, and the ratification remains pending in Chile and Peru. It is just unthinkable to have Chile somehow withdraw from one of its most remarkable achievements, the CPTPP, which was designed to create and expand value chains. And that is usually my go-to point when it comes to the CPTPP, because it also elevates the rules of the game when it comes to trade, liberalization, and facilitation. We all in Canada hope that Chile can ratify the CPTPP just to deepen its commitment with trade openness within the APEC economies. My second point is that Peru, along with Mexico and Colombia, founded the Pacific Alliance in 2011 to create a partnership of an already open trading economies to enhance its leverage exporting outside the region to countries such as China, India, and for sure the ASEAN economies, besides other larger partners like Australia and New Zealand. So the Pacific Alliance have thrived in creating economies of scale, boost investment, participating in international negotiations, trade fairs, trade facilitation, projects, and all under the APEC umbrella. In my opinion, the most important achievement of the Pacific Alliance was and still is this deep network of business alliances and councils that allows economic coordination and have enhanced regional supply chains and business partnerships along the way. Notwithstanding, there are problems. The Pacific Alliance as a bloc has stalled and it's reached its peak in terms of business alliances and trade liberalization efforts, first because of the Trump administration pressure over NAFTA that shifted Mexico's international trade interests into salvaging the relationship with its main commercial partner, for sure. All other partnerships, including the CPTPP and the Pacific Alliance, took a backseat. Then multiple and complex political crises across the region but forced the bloc to slow down its pace of reforms and projects of regional convergence. Since the Pacific Alliance has not a set of formal agencies to run its business, it heavily depends on ministers of trade, foreign services, national business councils to advance their goals. And it's fair to say that the future of the CPTPP, as much of the Pacific Alliance, is on the line, or at least will face a crucial test after the Chilean, Peruvian, and Colombian presidential elections that will take place between this year and 2022. Even more, the Constitutional Assembly in Chile will also be determinant in the way Chile deals with trade liberalization and foreign direct investment. Issues such as labor and environmental reforms are at the forefront as much as equity and social justice. My last point is about Canada, which has been an enthusiastic partner of the CPTPP and was among the first economies to negotiate an FTA with Chile in the 1990s. Even without the Chilean ratification, trading goods from Canada to Chile has grown the most among the CPTPP Latin American partners, with around 60% annual growth, has diminished for sure since 2009, mainly because of the US-China trade war and the pandemic, but is important nonetheless. What is more, Canada is an enthusiastic investor in Chile, especially in extractive industries. Until last year, Canada has channeled around $5 billion in new investments in the 4 countries of the Pacific Alliance, and Chile usually captures around 10% of this total. In addition, Canada was among the first countries to ask what will become associated partner of the Pacific Alliance and is negotiating a free trade agreement with the bloc. Until the beginning of the pandemic, we have around 8 rounds of negotiation and a favorable opinion of the Canadian Parliament to this agreement, enthusiastic collaboration among many stakeholders, investors, and civil society organizations alike. So this background allows me, about Chile and the Pacific Alliance partners, allows me to present this full circle conclusion about the significance of these regional initiatives to advance cooperation with ASEAN and the Asia-Pacific economies as a whole. If anything, because both groups have a great chance of making history with an open digital trade market that is on the making. What is more, this is extremely important also as a stepping stone into a broader multilateral negotiation that is currently underway at the WTO that will enhance this one single, usually overlooked pillar of the CPTPP, which is trading services, that is the real future for this alliance. I will open to answer any questions during the Q&A, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace, for that. Mr. Chéré, I wonder if we could turn the floor over to you to talk a little bit more from the Canadian perspective. And just for the audience, I just also want to add to some of the past accomplishments that Mr. Chéré and positions has held. Was the former Premier of Quebec, Quebec being the 2nd largest province in Canada, and also a very strong advocate for Canada-EU trade agreements and an advocate overall for Canadian trade. We couldn't have somebody more qualified to speak to this issue. Over to you, Mr. Chéré.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and I hope that everyone can hear me well. Let me start by saying how delighted I am to participate. I think this is probably the inaugural event of both foundations working together. There's 3 of them scheduled. And I just wanted to say how great an initiative this is. It is a very good idea for Chileans and Canadians to caucus together and to compare notes, to look at our respective positions on the trade agenda in the world, and in a context of multilateralism to which we are both very committed to work together. And I understand that Chile has not yet ratified the CPTPP, and we are going to be very careful not to mesh ourselves into domestic issues. But if there's anything at all that, from our experience, that you can draw upon, we'd be delighted to share it, the good and the bad. And let me start with a very brief reminder of what Canada's vital interest is. We are a country of over 38 million people, and we are a country that is privileged to have a high standard of living. The reason for that is because we trade. We are also one of the most trade-dependent countries in the world. Our trade has a few characteristics. It is very much about, natural resources. Energy comes first. I mean, oil and gas would be first on the list, but it's also the forest industry and its agri-food in particular, which is a big part of what the CPTPP is about. And it includes also technology and a number of things. But Canada is very much a knowledge-based economy who's blessed with these resources. And on the trade side, we heavily depend on these resources for trade. Actually, our weakness has been our ability to get small and medium enterprises more invested and involved in trade. The other characteristic is that we live next to the United States, which is sometimes a blessing and sometimes not. And the United States have been good neighbors and allies and friends of ours, but the United States is a superpower, and superpowers behave a certain way, and that's part of the context of what we're dealing with today. On trade, for example, I'll give you an example. If you do a trade agreement with the United States, there's an unwritten rule. If the Americans don't like what's happening, they'll just override it in certain instances. And that's the behavior of superpowers. They can write their own rules. So, and Canada's part of the feature of Canadian politics has been to learn to manage that relationship, at which we have been fairly successful in doing, I would say, up until the election of Mr. Trump, which made things a lot more complicated for everyone else. On the CPTPP, it's an interesting story. I was premier when it was launched, and I was very supportive of it. But Canada was not invited to this party at the outset. We were not part of the CPTPP. We had to invite ourselves in. And thankfully, countries like Chile were the ones who opened the door. That's why it would be ironic if, after inviting us into the negotiations and allowing us to be there, Chile would not follow through by ratification. And we went into the negotiations on a defensive mode because we wanted to protect the interests that we had. It wasn't on an offensive mode. It wasn't so much that we were looking for something to gain. We were at the outset trying to protect the gains we already had. For example, we had learned from the South Korea negotiations that if you allow another country to be able to get ahead of you, which was the United States in our case, well, they're going to steal your lunch. And that's exactly what happened in the case of South Korea, until we finally were able to get our own internal act together and to be able to get an agreement on this. As mentioned, I'm also co-chair of the Canada ASEAN Business Council. And Canada has had a good relationship with ASEAN, but in all honesty, we have not had a constant presence within ASEAN. Now, as we look at the bigger world, and because we are so trade dependent and much too dependent on the United States, in the last few years, we have made efforts to diversify our trade. CETA is a good example. The Canada-Europe Trade Agreement, Jeff mentioned, I was involved in that. We went to the Europeans after the Doha round went off the rails. I'm the one who went to the Commission to say, why don't you do a trade deal with Canada? And the arguments we put forward are relevant to what we're all experiencing today. We said to the Europeans, this is why you want to do it. If ever you want to do a trade deal with the United States, it'd probably be a good idea to do a trade deal with Canada first to establish the basic rules, and then you'll be in a better position to leverage a good trade deal for yourself with the Americans, keeping in mind, as I was mentioning earlier, that they're a superpower that behaves like a superpower. Well, the Europeans agreed with that. And we signed with the United States one of the most comprehensive deep trade agreements in the world, and it's working well. Though I would have to admit, in all honesty, that Canadians are not taking as much advantage of that trade agreement as we had hoped that they would at this point. Europeans are also doing very well, but nonetheless, this has created an environment where Canada is in a consolidated position. As an entry point to North America, we have this extraordinary trade agreement with Europe, which the Americans do not have. And Europe, by the way, is the #1 consumer market in the world, still close to 500 million people. And on the other hand, we have NAFTA, the second generation, called now CUSMA, the new acronym, which gives us access to the North American market with our Mexican and American partners. Not a bad place to be. If you're trying to access North American markets, that's a pretty good position for you to be in. But we are, and we know and acknowledge that economic growth is going to be happening in Asia. Thus our presence with ASEAN. We've been trying to push on our ASEAN partners to get a trade agreement. They have been more or less interested. They're not indifferent, but there are 4 countries within ASEAN who are already part of CPTPP, which includes Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. And so Canada is now looking at the opportunity of doing bilateral agreements within the ASEAN zone, in particular with Indonesia and the Philippines. We did take good note, as Dr. Menon mentioned earlier, of RCEP. And we always viewed RCEP as a possibility. And RCEP, in all frankness, doesn't have the depth of CETA or CPTPP, but we should not underestimate how much it will install within the region a logic of trade, of cooperation. And there are, very strong geopolitical consequences to RCEP that all of us must take into account. So as we look at the bigger picture and we look to the future, we're dependent on trade. We acknowledge, by the way, that trade has been the extraordinary locomotive of economic growth, of wealth creation in the world since the 1980s, all the way up to the financial and economic recession of 2008. It has pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And one of the hard lessons that Canada has learned from our own internal debates is that on issues like the environment, jobs, job security, transition, and training, these are very much issues that are the domestic responsibility of each country. And Canada very jealously preserves and protects its sovereignty in regards to its ability to act on sanitary issues, health issues, education, and protecting its natural environment. And we are on the forefront of that. We would, we can certainly understand why a number of people would ask questions about these trade agreements. But in the end, if we want to create wealth and prosperity, if we want to encourage a world that is based on multilateralism, we believe that this is the kind of trade agreement that all of us should be signing on to. And hopefully, as time goes by, the American administration will look at CPTPP differently, as the Obama administration did, as also as a very much a strategic pivot towards Asia. And will we want to be part of this club, and to the advantage of all the partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Charest. I think we can open now the floor to question and answer. I have some questions to kick off the discussion. If the panelists could all maybe turn their cameras back on, and I can address these to the group. And I think we can just determine if anybody has a comment to make on some questions. I've had a number come through the chat box that have been focused on environmental and sustainable kind of green industry and that component of trade within ASEAN, within the CPTPP in particular. I wonder, in particular, when we talk about, so that's almost a two-level question. In one hand, it's looking about how can we use CPTPP and ASEAN and engagement through these FTAs in order to advance environmental sustainability and address climate change within the Asia Pacific region. And on the other hand, how do we communicate to a domestic audience that are concerned that ratification or involvement in these multilateral FTAs could have a negative effect on domestic level environmental issues, particularly with respect to natural resource extraction and exploitation? So a big question, but a lot of people, I think, have expressed that interest and concern about how to address that through the existing mechanisms, and also how to communicate and address that back into the domestic constituents that are going to be so critical to bring on side in order for ratification in the case of Chile, and for advocacy, perhaps with respect to Canada.
Do I jump in?
Sure, go for it, Grace.
Well, in my experience, especially in Latin American countries, the domestic side of the negotiation is as important of the international side of the negotiation, and is usually overlooked. So whenever we negotiate and then implement a free trade agreement, much more talking about the CPTPP that has an additional level of complexity because it enhances global value chain. It really needs a lot of discussion, a lot of education processes, engage with civil society organizations on a regular basis. So it's a way of addressing also the interests of the many constituencies that may feel really probably affected by the agreement. So one of the issues that Canada has done very well is creating tables or even cafe talks about free trade agreements, engage with small and medium enterprises, engage with civil society organizations, and especially the ones that are really concerned about environmental issues. For example, not many people know in Latin America that the free trade agreement, the CPTPP, has a whole chapter on indigenous rights and traditional knowledge that has opened many opportunities for indigenous peoples and populations across the globe. So I think the first stepping stone is to re-engage into process of domestic negotiation inside, and also programs of implementation that address different issues regarding environmental, social concerns, labor standards, opportunities also for the people who have lost jobs, especially during and after the pandemic and the post-pandemic world.
Jeff, if you want, and thank you, Grace, those are very, the reference to Canada, I want to react to by saying that when we entered into trade negotiations in the late 80s with the United States, and I was part of the federal government at the time, we did create sectoral advisory committees called SAGITs. SAGITs was the acronym, Sectoral Advisory Group, to interact. And when we did CETA with Europe, we also had a constant consultation process with civil society, which included people from the sector of culture, for example. I'll give you an example. Canada has fought very hard over the years to protect its ability to support materially our cultural sector and the arts, and to avoid it being scooped into the scope of trade agreements and the rules of trade. Now, this was extremely difficult for American neighbors to understand. Their view is that culture is business, period. I mean, it was mysterious to them, but that was for us a red line, and those consultations were constant. I do want to return, though, to sum up what our experience has been. We have jealously preserved, and CPTPP does that, our ability and our sovereign ability to legislate and act in any way we feel we must to protect our environment, our healthcare systems, and our education. CPTPP does not in any way compromise that sovereign ability of either Chile, Canada, or Japan to do that. And there's all the precedents of the other trade agreements that demonstrate that. Now, I think that's how you communicate that. I'm not sure in the Chilean environment, but certainly Canada, I can speak to Canada's experience, and And that's why the trade agreements have had some wide support here. On climate, it's a good example. There's more and more countries like France or Europe who are saying we're not going to enter into trade agreements with countries or regions who do not subscribe and support the Paris Climate Accord. And now, is that a good or a bad idea? Trade negotiators may have another view of mixing both, but politically, that's what's happening right now in the world. So I'm fairly bullish. I think the trade should happen. It allows prosperity and it allows us more money to protect our environment.
Could I just add a little bit to what's, I think most of the points have already been made, but I think, as Jean was just saying, at the end of the day, it'll be national policies and regulations that will have to safeguard, countries, the environment from the consequences of these sort of trade promoting agreements that we engage in. The agreements themselves are not going to be able to do very much in pushing forward that agenda and protecting the environment. There's some of it in some of the more deeper bilateral agreements. The environment chapters are quite sophisticated, but still, I think it's basically guarding against the consequences of these agreements and protecting your environment while you pursue, prosperity through trade and investment as a result of liberalization through these agreements. And then you've got global initiatives. That's where you actually go and negotiate, sort of carbon reductions and so on. But one point I'd like to make is there is this potential, say, to try and harmonize rules over time as you mature in our negotiations to avoid, this race to the bottom and trying to attract, dirty industries, into your country by competing and sort of, weakening environmental protection. If you can sort of set standards that all countries, all members of an agreement have to comply with, then you can avoid this the bottom, which will involve, dirty industries migrating to countries with the lowest sort of protections. And potentially these regional agreements can play a role in limiting that.
Schmidt-Hebel, I see your hand is up.
Thank you. Yes, let me bring in our experience in the case of Chile. Let me start with environment. Number one, I'm personally and academically and professionally convinced that the environmental challenge and the environmental unsustainability, and including but not excluding other components, including climate change, is the number one challenge for humanity, for the present, the future, and the long-term survival of humanity. Having said that, I think that trade agreements are not the most efficient way to cope with environmental unsustainability. There are many other ways to cope with it. In the case of Chile, Chile was one of the first countries in the world that committed to zero emissions of CO2 or CO2 equivalents by 2050. In preparation, this commitment is now 2.5 years old. This was in preparation of Chile hosting COP25 in Santiago in 2019, which had to be moved to another country in Europe because of our political tensions in late 2019. But Chile is very committed, and it's very much on the path of attaining over the medium and long term a greener economy. Up to now, 25% of our energy production is based on clean or green resources, mostly solar and wind energy. We will be very close to 50% toward the end of this decade. And this is in parallel to many other commitments of the government and of subsequent governments which will follow this policy to achieve in 2050 zero net emissions. Having said that, let me also underscore something which Jean and Grace and Jeff and Stuart mentioned also from the perspective of Canada, which is the fact that CPTPP takes care of the rights of indigenous peoples. It takes care of environmental standards, and in no way, no dimension, it inhibits the sovereignty of parliament, of legislators, to introduce future laws that may set higher standards than those which currently exist in Chile or in any other member of CPTPP. All these facts are systematically denied by a very small group of NGOs in Chile and a small group of legislators who are convinced by these NGOs that CPTPP infringes on the sovereignty of the legislator, that it adds to environmental unsustainability and other issues which they criticize. Our Undersecretary of International Relations, its acronym is SUBRE in Spanish, has issued a very extensive document in which the Undersecretary takes care of each and every critical point raised by the opposition to CPTPP in Chile. When this document was launched, it was widely distributed, and none of the people and organizations that criticized had an answer to this document issued by our Undersecretary of International Relations. But still, in the current world of fake news, of social media, multiplying lies and fake news about CPTPP, it's very, very hard to have systematic dialogue which people which opine in different ways from, I would say, the mainstream view that it is in the benefit of Chile and of all its citizens to deepen our trade, investment, and even political integration through mechanisms like CPTPP. And so I would very much like to learn, I'm learning now through your interventions, I would very much like to learn how you did in Canada through these meetings with citizens, through rational discussion and exchange of opinion, to number one, to face the groups who think differently, and then to discuss with them based on the facts of what is in and what is not in the commitments by CPTPP. And I'm sure that beyond this very useful panel, we will find ways so that we can learn from you how we could do it better.
So we've come to the end of the allotted time that we have for this particular session. I realize we have a number of questions that we weren't able to get to. Many of them, however, are very relevant for the next session that we're going to be doing with the Chile Pacific Foundation on June 9th around ASEAN and CPTPP with respect to the geopolitics of the issue. And we can get a little bit more into some of the questions that we have in the chat around India's role with respect to the CPTPP, great power relations within that dynamic, ASEAN's position within some of the broader strategic thinking within the region, and address some of the questions that unfortunately we weren't able to get to today simply because we came up on the end of our time, because we have so much content and so many, I think, wonderful perspectives that these panelists and the speakers were able to bring today. So First of all, I think we did a very effective tour of ASEAN's regional architecture, thought through the Chilean experience, both with respect to engaging through the CPTPP and with ASEAN, but also a lot, I think, of useful commentary and perspective and context around the domestic considerations and challenges that Chile finds with respect to ratifying the CPTPP. I think we learned a lot here with respect to some of the myths versus realities, the importance about educating the public, the mechanisms that the Chilean government has put into place to address some of these issues. I think that was incredibly informative and very helpful for us to think about how to move these opportunities forward in a way that benefit broadly Chilean trade engagement in the ASEAN region. And I think we similarly looked at Canada to think through how it can engage more effectively in the region, how it can also think about diversifying its trade through engagement with ASEAN, and in particular, moving away from some of the dependencies we have on existing bilateral trade relationships, particularly with the United States. All of these things, I think, were very informative. Thank you to all the speakers for being part of the discussion today, and the panelists for taking time out of your busy schedule, and indeed, in some instances, late night and early morning. Do please tune in again to our June 9th ASEAN discussion around geopolitics. We will get to many of the questions that were raised today that unfortunately we weren't able to address. But thank you to the Chile Pacific Foundation for your partnership, and thank you on behalf of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada for attending today, and we look forward to continuing this conversation going forward with our next two jointly hosted events. So with that, I'll conclude my discussion, and Stuart, if you'd like to say anything, or we can conclude.
No, I just want to say my thanks as well to all the panelists. I think it was really a very interesting and thoughtful conversation. I think we both can learn from each other, and I think that's critical. So thanks individually to each of the panelists, and it's very heartening to see how we can take something like this and move it to the next level at the next session. So again, thanks to all those attending, and thank you to the panelists.